Hello, and welcome to session 2 of the Pyramid Model Training Series. So today we're going to be talking about expectations and rules. Right now we are looking at the Google Classroom, and I have loaded all of the handouts and activities that go along with this presentation. So we will be moving back and forth between the slide presentation and the materials that are posted in the Google Classroom to support this presentation. So last week I posted the first session focused on relationships. We talked a lot about building relationships with children, building relationships with families, and in particular thinking about how to maintain those relationships and build relationships in different ways as we've moved to virtual work. And it's been really great in our coaching calls and team calls over this week to really hear all of the things that you're doing, to hear about the connections that you're making with families, and also the way that you're supporting each other as a team. What I'm starting to really recognize is that while we may all be physically separated, I think that in many ways the relationships that we've built are getting stronger during this time, because families are really seeing you as a resource and as a support system. Children are really excited to see you through video calls or recordings that you've sent, are excited to share pictures and videos of what they're doing. So all of that is really wonderful. The other thing that we have been talking about is really making sure that we're being really intentional around how we're interacting and maintaining professionalism and boundaries while building those relationships. So I do encourage you to reflect upon, did you try anything from the content last week? Was there anything that was challenging? Are there any things that you felt were really successful, something you might adjust or do a little bit different? So as I shared, this session we're focusing on expectations and rules, and we're really thinking program-wide expectations. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. But you might be thinking about the fact that each classroom has their own sets of rules. And what's really helpful is if, as a program, as Barbara Chambers, we can come to agreement about what are some program-wide expectations. So some very broad expectations that you all have of children, and establish some common language around that. And that's something that I'm hoping that we can do more work on when we're all back together and during the PD week before school starts in the fall. All right, but we're going to talk about the importance of teaching expectations, being developmentally appropriate in terms of creating expectations, as well as teaching and helping children to meet those expectations, right? And thinking about that one of the strategies to support children in understanding the expectations and meeting those expectations is providing clear descriptive feedback. So as I said, we are going to be turning to the early learning standards with each session, and we are focusing specifically on the domain of social emotional development. And we can think about this within the standard of children engage in positive interactions with others, and really understanding the expectations and meeting those expectations, which fits under playing cooperatively with one another, using appropriate ways of interacting, taking turns, listening to peers. Those are all general expectations that we often have for preschool age children. So here is our pyramid again, and we will continually refer to the pyramid. So, the effective workforce is at the foundation. That's why it's so important that you're really thinking about what are your needs right now. We've been having conversations about setting boundaries, of really being intentional in terms of our work hours. So making sure that we're doing things that are effective and are supporting children's development and learning and supporting the relationships that we have with children and their families. But that you're also not working 12 hours a day, that you're recognizing that we're all experiencing a crisis right now, and how do we support our own needs and the needs of our families while still continuing to work and supporting the children from your classroom and their families, right? So that effective workforce is an important piece, and I think right now, particularly thinking about your own well-being and mental health is a big piece of that, and balancing personal commitments and professional expectations. And then we have our first tier, which is really developmentally appropriate practice, and this is something that all children need and meets the needs of about 80% of children. So we started by talking about nurturing and responsive relationships. Now we're moving into thinking about expectations and rules, which is kind of the midway point here, that we think about that within our environment and sort of how do we set expectations, how do we help children to understand how we are in the classroom. So really thinking about the environment, not just in terms of the physical environment, but also the social environment. The second tier is our targeted social emotional supports. So these are the ways in which we intentionally teach skills to children. Here we're going to talk about friendship skills. We're going to talk about emotional literacy. We're going to talk about problem solving, anger management, skills that it's helpful to really be intentional in teaching all children, but we know that 20%, about 20% of children need that additional support, right? And so as we said, 80% of children's needs are met just with the developmentally appropriate practice by focusing on positive relationships, having clear, consistent expectations and rules, how we set up our physical environment, all of those things that we think about when we think about developmentally appropriate practice. So out of the 20% of remaining children, 15 to 18% of those children's needs are met with the additional targeted social emotional support. So really thinking about that more intentional targeted instruction around specific social emotional skills. And that leaves about 3 to 5% of the population that need additional support in the intensive interventions that is at the top of our pyramid. And that's really when we begin thinking about, is there a developmental issue? Do we need to bring in early intervention? Is the child experiencing a developmental delay? Is there a chronic healthcare need? Is there a medical issue going on? Has the child experienced trauma? Is there a mental health need that you need to bring in the mental health consultant, that you need to be bringing in additional supports outside of just you as the teacher and the teaching team? Okay. So again, this is where we go back to our handout. So our handout of the pyramid model is from the first session. So you can refer back to that in the handouts from the first section, but we will look at our indicators of practice for our second session. And again, this is a really helpful resource. And I'm hoping that you're really using this and even printing it out and filling it out. So we always start with a second page and going through and looking at these are the practices that we will be reviewing that fall within this session and teaching, developing program-wide expectations, recognizing the importance of teaching expectations in developmentally appropriate ways, strategies that you can do that, and then utilizing effective descriptive feedback. And so rating currently, is this something that you've been doing consistently, occasionally, or not yet? Thinking about ways in which you're currently doing this, or you were doing this back when we were all together and school was open. And things that you might try, things that you can also be thinking about again during this time as we're supporting families, how you might share some of this information, how you might adapt some of this information, and helping parents to think about how to create very simple, clear expectations for the home, maybe expectations for different areas of the home. So, you know, what kind of behaviors, what can we do in the bedroom? What can we do in the kitchen? You know, there are different kinds of rules that you have for different kinds of activities and different spaces in the home, as well as maybe if families are living somewhere where they can go outside into a yard or a play space where there aren't other people. So you can also think about that, but you can be thinking about what you might want to try in the fall when we all go back to school. Or perhaps if we want to be really optimistic in May and June. Okay. So then the next page to do some summary and thinking is to fill out and creating one goal for yourself in terms of one thing that you will do or will do differently. And then identify specific steps or a to-do list to reach that goal. Okay. So you may be wondering, or some people wonder, why are we spending all of this time focusing on social emotional development? I know typically one of the things that all of you are eager for me to talk to you about is class and those instructional strategies. Well, we know that social emotional skills, social emotional well-being is at the heart of school readiness, is at the heart of children being able to be successful in the classroom. And as we're thinking about those instructional support strategies around concept development, quality of feedback, language modeling, but particularly concept development, you have to have these systems in place. You have to have built positive relationships. You have to have an engaging, organized environment, and that children know what to do. They know what the expectations are. They know how to meet those expectations, which then frees you to have those individual interactions that really support the kinds of teaching practices that we're looking for in instructional support with class. The other thing that I would say is that quality of feedback, you know, we're going to be talking about descriptive feedback. Sometimes that falls within quality of feedback with maybe a feedback loop or some of that back and forth of where you're giving positive feedback to a child to support their persistence in a challenging task, right? And sometimes it falls within behavior management, within the classroom organization domain. Okay. When children do not have these social skills, we often see challenging behaviors, right? This is a toddler example, though I do believe I have seen some attempted and perhaps even some successful biting happening in some of the classrooms with children that may not have the language skills or may not have the self-regulation skills. Um, and the point of this slide is to really help us to remember that we have to teach these social skills. We have to teach children what the expectations are, what the rules are, and we have to teach them how to meet their needs so that they're not engaging in challenging behaviors. All behavior is communication. And children are really, they're testing, they're seeing what works, right? And if they want something and they engage in a challenging behavior, whether it's biting or pushing or taking a toy, and they end up getting what they want, then they're learning that that is how, that's an effective strategy. And so we need to teach them different ways of getting their needs met that meets our expectations. So I'm going to give an example and thinking about how we teach skills to young children. And I'm going to start a little bit with a non-example. So, I think that learning how to drive is something that I think is a pretty concrete skill. Many of you, well, you probably all remember when you learned how to drive. Many of you have probably taught a teenager how to drive. I think about teaching my middle child to drive. And you don't start by just saying, oh, you turned 16, here's the keys to the car, go have fun, right? That might lead to a few challenges, right? So we have a very specific way of teaching, right? We have rules, right? So depending upon what state you're living in, or if you're in the District of Columbia, there are specific rules around driving, right? And so the first step is to get the motorist handbook, get the rules of the road and learn those, right? We sign up for driver's ed. We learn about the different signs and what those signs mean, right? So in the state of Maryland, you have to sign up for driver's ed. There's 2 weeks of classes. I believe it was like 2 hours a day in the evening, 5 days a week. And then there was some behind the wheel instruction. And so after you had finished the in-class and had taken the test to get the driver's permit, then you would have behind the wheel instruction with a driver's ed teacher. And in addition, as the parent, it was my responsibility to provide the opportunity and track. I think it was 60 hours behind the wheel, and that it had to be, I think 10 of those hours had to be at night. What we did is that just as our children were learning how to drive, we'll use the example of my middle daughter. So every time we went anywhere, she drove, right? So it was driving to school, driving home from school, going to the grocery store, whatever, right? And that was the process of getting those hours and having that practice, right? And me becoming comfortable and letting her practice driving on highways and all of those things, right? And then once you've hit those hours of practice, then you take the driver's test, and hopefully you pass and you get your driver's license. Now, the reason that I give the example of my middle daughter, Lily, is that she is a rower, and she used to row with a community club on the Anacostia in DC. We live in Maryland. We're about an hour away. You put in traffic, it's about an hour and a half, maybe 2. when she got her driver's license, it wasn't like, oh, okay, now you can drive yourself into DC for rowing practice. No, I was still driving her, right? And so there was a process of her learning, right? Of where she was in the car with me, she was observing what was going on, she learned the route with traffic in this area. You know, you use GPS, your phone tells you where to go. We didn't always go the same way each time, but it was pretty similar, right? So she learned how to go, and you're getting on 270 and then 495 and then what was it, 695 and then 290. You know, I'm not even remembering my numbers, but as you get onto those highways in DC, it's also pretty important to remember what lane to be in, right? And when you need to change lanes and all of those things. So her being in the car and paying attention was part of the process of she was learning by watching me, right? And then eventually I started where on Saturday mornings when she had practice, I would let her drive with me in the car, right? So she got to practice, but in a low stakes environment when there wasn't the same kind of traffic, right? Eventually we got to where she could drive herself on the weekends. Then we got to where she could drive to her afternoon practices with me in the car. Eventually, by her senior year, she was able to go to rowing on her own. So it was a process that there were steps of where she was learning a new skill, and she was slowly learning to do it with less and less support from myself, right? And as we think about that teaching, we really have to think about what is our role as a teacher, and moving from a very hands-on, engaged interaction to being able to step back, right? Which takes us to this quote and really thinking about how we think about teaching and what skills we think about, right? Because thinking about teaching a child to drive or a teenager how to drive, that makes complete sense. That's not something that you're going to argue with me about, or that you're going to question, or you're going to be surprised by, that there would be all of these steps, that it would be a very thought out process, right? There are lots of resources and curricula around learning how to read and how we teach children to read. Teaching children things like swimming or math or whatever, right? But we don't often really think about how we teach children to behave, how we teach them what the expectations are and how to meet those expectations. We tend to assume that children just know, right? Or we think that by punishing children for not meeting those expectations, that that's how we teach them the expectations. And oftentimes, children don't understand how to meet the expectations. They just know that they haven't been successful. So as I was giving the example of teaching Lily how to drive, I was really highlighting these stages of learning, right? So in thinking about her going to rowing practice, when I was driving and she was paying attention, that was really show and tell, right? Where I was providing information. Driver's ed and the manual is that acquisition of where you're giving content, right? There then needs to be the ability to practice, but you need to be able to practice in a safe environment with support, right? And so that was really where we started, with her being able to drive with me in the car on Saturdays when there wasn't traffic. And then her being able to do the same thing with me in the car in the afternoons as she became more skilled, right? And then you get to the maintenance and of where you're able to do the skill without support from an adult. And then thinking about being able to generalize those skills to another setting, right? So if we keep the driving analogy, for Lily to be able to do distance driving or driving on a highway independently to other places, right? You can think about it if we think about sharing or taking turns. Once a child has learned those skills in the classroom, are they able to use those skills at home? Right? Or are they able to use those skills when they're at a friend's house or a family member's house? Can they share with cousins? Things like that. So, as I said, we're going to start by talking about program-wide expectations. So program-wide expectations are rules that we have, or expectations of, so not rules, but broad expectations or qualities, characteristics that we want children to have, right? And again, as I was saying earlier, they are things that as a program, as Barbara Chambers, you all agree are things that are important to you, right? So they're something that are really adopted program-wide. Program-wide expectations should be phrased positively so that they should focus on what you want children to do. It provides that common language. And by having that common language and really that very simple, this is how we are when we're at school, as children learn those expectations and they learn how to meet those expectations, you really are providing you're spending less time responding to challenging behaviors and are able to spend more time engaging with children and really using those teaching practices that we've been talking about with class. So as we think about program-wide expectations, you want to develop 3 to 5 general expectations. You want to make sure that they're developmentally appropriate. They apply not only to what we expect of children or how we expect children to be, but also how we expect staff, adults to be. So this isn't just classroom teachers, but all adults in the building. We want to post them visually in classrooms and common areas. And teach them, providing concrete examples of what they look like, and to really be intentional and include them in your curriculum. So on the left-hand side, we have some examples of program-wide expectations, things like be kind, be fair, be a team player, things like that. So very broad statements. They are not specific rules like sit on your bottom, use your inside voice, sit crisscross, right? So we're going to go through some examples and look at ways in which programs post their expectations. So this is a program in Wisconsin that is a program-wide pyramid model site. So some states across the country are pyramid model states and receive support at the state level. Wisconsin is one of those states. I was part of their state leadership team, and I trained and coached programs. So programs could actually apply to become demonstration sites. And there was a commitment at the administrative level in implementing pyramid model practices across the program, and this is one of the demonstration sites. So their program-wide expectations are be safe, be kind, and be helpful. Right, and so they had this theme of a bee. Another example where they focused on caring, honesty, respect, and responsibility. And so they had this posted in lots of different places, had pictures of children illustrating what that looked like. They also had cards from the pyramid model site that had been printed out in terms of what kinds of behaviors fell within each of these expectations to really operationalize it, right? Here's another example of caring, honesty, respect, and responsibility, right? So this is the same program with the same program-wide expectations. And then they're operationalizing that in terms of saying, what does this look like? We've got, be kind to one another with words and actions, make good choices, walking feet, quiet voices, play together, get along, so on and so forth. And again, we've got pictures. And so you can see that these program-wide expectations are posted in multiple places in multiple ways. This is how it is posted in a toddler room. So what's significant about this picture, which is kind of hard to tell from just looking at it, but this is a cabinet in the classroom, so it's higher up. So this is not at the child's level. This is at the adult's level, right? Because with infants and toddlers, the expectations really are mostly talking about how are we as adults behaving. And then we're modeling that to the children, and we're beginning to give that language to the children. So this is an activity that we're actually going to be doing during the August in-service. But I want you to start thinking about, and maybe we can start having some conversations about what are some program-wide expectations. That as a full center, or at least across all of the pre-K classrooms, that you can all commit to. And what's important with starting with the program-wide expectations is that we always have to start with the expectations to then move into the rules. That there has to be that connection, that all the rules make sense within the framework of those expectations. Right. And so the rules really help children to know what to do in what settings at what times. As we've been talking about, when children understand the rules, when they understand how they're connected to the broader expectations, when they understand how to meet those rules and expectations, then you see less challenging behaviors and your children are more engaged in learning, and you're able to use the teaching practices that we want to be focusing on. So we're going to do a little bit of thinking in terms of what is a expectation versus what is a rule. So we've got a list here. I'm a problem solver, go up the ladder and down the slide, be a super friend, walking feet, respect myself and others, stay with my group, feet on the floor, and safety first. Right? So the rules are the things that talk about specific behaviors. Right? So go up the ladder, down the slide is a specific behavior. That's a rule. Right? Expectations are really about how you are. Right? So safety first. I am a problem solver. Those are expectations because they're broader statements that really focus on how we are when we are together in the classroom, in the hallways, on the playground. So one of the handouts that you have is a matrix. So in thinking about what are the rules, and how are they connected to expectations. So if we are looking at these expectations of be respectful of self, be respectful of others, and be respectful of surroundings, you can then list and you see these examples of, well, what does that look like in terms of what are the rules in the classroom, what are the rules in the bathroom, and what are the rules in the playground? And here is another example. Well, we're really focusing on preschool age children. I think this just helps to highlight that with younger children, it's really about what the adult is doing, right? And so, how does the adult support these rules in terms of how they set up the environment, what kinds of materials they place in the environment, and what the interactions look like with the children? With older children, we do expect the children to be following these behaviors, and we are creating rules that meet our expectations. But we also want to we still want to really think about and list out what are the things that we as the teacher, that we as the adults are doing. What are our rules in terms of how we behave and how we act? So some general guidelines when you're thinking about rules. And I know that you all have classroom rules. Many of you have them posted. But again, as we are preparing and thinking about when we get back, I mean, if we are fortunate enough to go back this school year, it really will in many ways be like starting a brand new year. But I do think more realistically, we're going to be thinking about these things and thinking about ways that you might adjust and maybe make some tweaks to your current practices in terms of what are your rules, how are you displaying those rules, how are you teaching and operationalizing those rules, and how are those rules connected to program-wide expectations. So these are some more examples of ways in which rules and expectations can be posted, and ways to teach children. Again, so having those photographs of children demonstrating what that looks like can also be helpful because children see themselves. And also just the activity of talking to children about the rules and taking those pictures helps to teach the rules. Here is another example of their highlighting we make good choices, right? And having those visuals in different interest centers in the classroom can be a helpful reminder. This is just another example of a way to post, maybe in the large group or circle area. So one of the, it is a handout, but it's also an activity. So we have our expectations matrix here, where you're listing the expectations and then you're listing the rules. Again, I think we need to have conversations as a team in terms of coming to an agreement about what those expectations are program-wide. And my expectation is that we're going to do that in August. But you can be thinking about that. And that's something that you can print out and do with your teaching team. So here is the example of what this looks like filled out. And really thinking about what are the rules in different settings. So if our expectations are be safe and be kind, what does that look like in the hallway? What does that look like in the bathroom? What does that look like during snack time, during large group time, outside, so on and so forth. Okay. And as we've been talking about intentionally really thinking about and setting the rules and then posting those expectations and rules helps you to be intentional and plan, helps children to understand what the rules are and follows them, and helps us all to remember, right? Because consistency is also a piece that's really important. And so having that visual helps us as adults to be consistent in enforcing the rules and helps children in remembering the rules. So these are just some other examples of posting rules. This is great that this program was able to post rules outdoors. This is actually a metal sign. Right? So the next step, so first you set your program-wide expectations, then you're thoughtful in terms of setting what the rules are, creating visuals, and posting the rules is to intentionally teach the rules. So one strategy is right way, wrong way. And we're going to look at a video that demonstrates this.
I have a picture of a friend who's running in the classroom, using his feet for running. Guys, is that a stop or is that a go? It's a stop. Can you show me your red side? Stop. That's a stop. I see some reds. Very good. That's a stop. I have a friend, and you know what? They want to get through. So what he does is he kicks his friend's leg out of the way. Is kicking a go or is kicking a stop? It's a stop. Kicking is a stop. We use our feet for walking. What are go things and what are stop things? What are stop things? Now, I have one other thing I want to do with you.
Okay. So that was a really simple activity to teach rules and expectations. You know, I like the little stop and go signs. Someone had pointed out to me, which I thought was really very clever of them to realize, is that you really should have two. So one that's red and one that's green, and that it's you know, red on both sides or green on both sides, because for preschool age children, the color that they're looking at is probably the color that they think it is, right? Rather than if I'm looking at the red, then the green is on the other side, so I'm showing you the green for go. But having those hands-on prompts can also really be helpful in engaging children. And that also falls under the variety of modes and materials for regard for student perspective and instructional learning formats, and really thinking about how you're engaging children and giving them hands-on learning. Here is a way to then operationalize and have an activity of where children are sorting cards by stop and go. Books can also be helpful. This particular slide is highlighting books for younger children, but things like Know David and the dinosaur series, I always forget exactly what it's called, but when the dinosaur goes to school and dinosaur doesn't want to go to bed and all of those things. There's lots of really great books for preschool age children as well. You also want to regularly review the rules, right? And I often feel like, particularly at the beginning of the year, that morning meeting or circle time is the best way to use that time is to really focus on social emotional, to focus on the rules and reviewing the rules.
Okay, let's do our classroom rule. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I need some helpers. Let me see. Sean, what's our first classroom rule? We use walking feet. Show me walking feet. Show me running. Where can you run? Outside. Good job. Joanna, what's another classroom rule? Inside voices. Say hello really, really loud. Where can you use that voice? Outside. Say hello using your inside voice. Say hello and then Deja, what's another classroom rule? Gentle touches. What would be a gentle touch? A pat on the back. Very good. How about a shaking the hand? Say good morning. Good morning. Or a hug. That's right. Good job. Or hold hands. Okay, let me see. Thomas, what is another classroom rule? We take turns. Jacob, why do we take turns? Other people might want to share. Can everybody play in the library at the same time? They can't fit. Okay. Can everybody play on the computer at the same time? So we take turns so everybody has a chance to play and share. You're right, everybody can go outside, but can everybody slide at the same time?
No.
That would be dangerous. We can take turns. You're right. Okay. Is that safe?
No.
No, it's not. Colton, can you tell us our last classroom rule? We clean up. Where do we clean up? Everywhere. Why do we clean up? We don't want to step on our toys. You might slip, okay? Where do we clean up and where do we put our toys? Where else? In the closet. Very good. The food and very good. Okay, let's say our rules together. Kaylee, will you point? Okay, point to them as we say them, please. The very top. Let's say them together. We use walking feet. We have inside voices. We use gentle touches. We take turns. And we clean up. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so you can tell that this is a regular part of their routine, that the children know the rules. They understand why the rules are in place, and they're able to regularly talk about them. We also want to remind children of the rules as we're transitioning to a specific activity. With this video, I want you to watch for things that are good examples, as well as to notice if you're seeing some non-examples or some strategies that you might think about doing different.
Project. Oh, my friends like messy projects. We're going to be working with glue. Do we put glue in our mouths? Do we eat it? Mm-mm. Glue can make you really, 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 really sick. We're going to be working with glue. And we're going to be working with different kinds of seeds. See these seeds? Do we throw them at friends at the table? No. Do we eat them? No. Do we throw them on the floor? No. We just put them on our project.
Okay. So in thinking about things that she did well and things that we want to do, introducing an activity, showing the materials, talking about what children do with those materials are all great strategies in helping children to be successful. You want to make sure that your language is focused on what it is that you want children to do rather than what it is that you don't want children to do. Because in a lot of ways, she just introduced a whole bunch of ideas to these children of things that they could do, right? That they might not even have been thinking about. And then the final is to remind children how to follow rules.
Walk to the movie theater? Yeah. No, we should walk. We should
walk.
It's too far.
He hit me first. No, he hit me first.
Open, shut, open, shut them. Open, shut them, open, shut them. Okay. Right now it's time to listen, please, okay? Our mouths are quiet. We need to keep our hands to ourselves, please. And if someone is doing something that you don't like, what can you say to them?
Please stop.
You can say, please stop. But if someone's asking you to stop, then you need to keep your hands to yourself,
No,
please.
he did it to me first.
So what could you do? What could you tell him?
Please stop.
Please stop what?
Please stop hitting me.
Okay, thank you. So we need to use our words, please, okay?
Please stop.
All right. Thank you. That's good job. Perfect. All right, I see my friends are ready to be what? What do we have to do?
Count.
We have to count how many.
Okay, so she responded very calmly to the behavior that was beginning, right? She noticed it right away. She was proactive in responding. She did a short, the open shut them song to get children's focused attention. And then she helped the children to problem solve and reminding them of the rule of keeping hands to themselves and what do you say when a friend is bothering. We also want to make sure that we're reinforcing the rules, right? And that's where we get into the descriptive feedback, right? So it's important that you are noticing and commenting when children are meeting expectations. It is very important that when children misbehave is not the only time that you are talking about expectations, right? And it's very easy for that to happen of where we're really only talking about and responding to behavior when we're seeing behaviors that we don't like. Here is an example of reinforcing the rules. I will say that this interaction goes on a little bit longer than I would have liked, and particularly because these are younger children. So we always want to think about, especially when highlighting individual children during a large group, about the pacing and the timing, that children aren't waiting. But to really, the takeaway for this video is to focus on that individual attention and recognition of meeting rules.
Hey, Rashanti is crisscross. Johnny's crisscross. Let's see what else crisscross.
Me. Yeah.
Your leg's not crisscross?
Yeah.
Crisscross? Elise is crisscross. Who else is crisscross?
Me.
James is crisscross. And Andrew. Oh my goodness. Good job. Andrew is crisscross. Tyree. Good job. And Nate is crisscross.
So again, she's using a creative strategy to recognize the children, but you want to think about pacing, and I also recognize that I just crisscross applesauce is considered a pretty restrictive way to sit, and that time is often lost with teachers redirecting children in terms of sitting crisscross applesauce. Okay. So thinking about our directions and being direct in how we tell children what the expectations are and what we expect them to do. So again, going back into our Google Classroom, Be Direct is posted here as a handout. It is also posted here as a quiz, right? That you can, for you to complete, and it looks like 2 out of 15 of you have already done that. So great. We also want to make sure that we are providing descriptive feedback and being very specific in the kind of feedback that we are giving, right? And again, this falls, when we think about class, this falls in several categories. So it can fall under positive climate, when you're giving descriptive positive feedback really with the intent of building relationships. It falls under behavior management when you're giving descriptive feedback with the goal of helping children understand the rules and expectations, or maybe redirecting behavior. And it can fall under quality of feedback when you are giving positive feedback to support a child in persisting in a challenging task. It also can fall under instructional learning formats with the clarity of learning objectives. So if your intent in providing that feedback and talking about what children are doing or talking about specific behaviors, rules, expectations, is that the content of the lesson is around expectations and you are focusing children's attention on the topic, then that would fall under clarity of learning objectives. And we would see this, like, for example, the video of the morning meeting where they were reviewing rules and expectations. So we have our cranky lady again saying, I shouldn't have to do anything. Kids know what they're supposed to do. Why should I have to compliment them, give them rewards, or offer incentives of any support? Or incentives of any sort. And, you know, I always kind of think about, well, how is that working, right? That if your goal really is to spend less time responding to challenging behaviors, the most effective thing is to recognize when children are meeting expectations. So when you think about your day-to-day experiences, not right now, especially for those of us who, or those of you who are by yourself and maybe not interacting with people, but in general, how many times a day do you hear what you're doing well? How many times a day do you tell individual children what they are doing well? Research shows that you can improve behavior by 80% just by pointing out what someone is doing correctly. And so then we have the pushback again of, I know I give positive feedback all the time. They still never do what I ask. How often do children comply with requests? Research shows that children comply with the rules 80% of the time. How often are children complimented for their behavior? Less than 2% of the time, right? So you might think that you're doing it, but to really start to be reflective and intentional in making a point of regularly providing positive and descriptive feedback to children, right? That is one of your most effective tools that you can use. As we think about descriptive feedback, we want to use this model of making sure that it's immediate, that it's frequent, that you're showing enthusiasm, that you're recognizing effort, right? Because children are not always successful. But if you recognize their effort, that helps them to persist, right? And sometimes something may be more challenging for one child than it is for another. So we want to recognize for that child where it's more challenging, the level of effort that they're making. And we want to make sure that it's descriptive so that children really understand what it is that we are wanting to see, what it is that we are providing that positive feedback about. We also want to make sure that we're using nonverbal positive feedback as well as verbal. Right, so one of the handouts that you have is the starters for positive feedback. Oh, and this, I need to replace this. I reformatted it so that it all fits on one page. But these are just some examples of ways to start descriptive feedback, some examples of ways to provide more detail in your feedback. And you'll see that when providing positive descriptive feedback happens consistently in your classroom, that you are modeling behavior for other children.
Today is Wednesday. Find the yellow pants.
Yellow.
Yellow. Good job.
She's a smart boy.
He is a smart boy.
Right? So just very simple.
Today is Wednesday.
But you can see that that was a common experience, right, for the child to comment. So another handout is Get Positive, which is also set up as a quiz in our Google Classroom, of having you rephrase statements using positive language. Okay, so we've been talking about having program-wide expectations, connecting those to the rules, having clear rules for different settings and times of the day, posting those visually, using strategies to specifically teach those skills. Moving into now, we've been talking about giving descriptive feedback. Another way that you can give feedback is through some of these visuals. And so these are examples of ways to highlight children meeting expectations. So this is an example of having handprints for different rules, recognizing when children are meeting those expectations. You do need to be very careful in making sure that you are recognizing all children, right? Because this can really turn into a negative if there's a child who is never recognized for meeting expectations, because then you are giving a very powerful message that they cannot be successful in the classroom. So this is a neat example of where they, which I think is nice also because it's very open-ended. So there's the beehive. Again, this is a program that has their bee. And it's just a board for recognizing positive behavior. So they're posting little sticky notes about behavior that they're seeing, right? The other thing that's really nice about this is that this is a nice reinforcement for families. So when families are coming in, they can see examples of their children's positive behavior. And the sticky notes grow each day. Okay? Again, thinking about ways to reinforce our expectations in different settings, right? So we're having those expectations and rules posted, as we talked about, not just in the classroom, but also in the hallway, also on the playground, but then calling that out when you're seeing it happening. So these are some other examples of ways in which teachers have recognized children meeting expectations. We've got the turtles. So here in the middle is Tucker Turtle is proud of you, and on the little turtles are children's names and the specific thing that they're providing feedback for. The picture on the right is a classroom created a tree, and on each branch they have a different expectation. So the one that we see is play together, and then again you have the turtles with specific examples of how the child met that expectation of playing together. Here's another example. So again, that pushback of, I don't have time to do all this stuff. These kids know what they should be doing. They just don't do it, right? Again, we go back with, well, how is that working for you? What we know is that you spend more time responding to challenging behaviors when you do not take the time to teach and reinforce the behaviors and expectations that you want to see. So here is a quote. I have come to a frightening conclusion. I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. Right? So to really think about, how are you building up children? How are you creating an environment that is safe and nurturing, where children feel capable and competent and feel safe to take risks and to try something that is hard? Because that's really what learning is about. Okay, so that takes us to the end of our session. Again, here I want to make sure that you are completing your inventory, that you are reviewing all of the handouts within the Google Classroom, that you're completing the quiz activities, and that you are commenting, which I see a lot of you doing with the different materials, and really thinking about how you're going to use this content, both with families and supporting them as they're at home, but also in thinking about your classroom when we all come back to school. And here is my contact information. Again, feel free to call, text, or email me. And I will see and talk to all of you soon.